would you please evaluate the significance of China's billion-plus population in the sense that they can keep producing millions of PhDs, anything they want.
Right.
So potentially they're a threat. On the other hand, they have a huge rural population that they have to feed and whatever. And then how do you compare this with India also?
Right. So it's a great question. I mean, one, China has enough people who are still in poverty in rural areas that it can continue even as it moves up the value chain of a more wealthy middle class. It has a huge internal market of low-cost labor. Which will be exhausted at some point, but not for decades. Now, there are questions about China's demographic path, and that because of the one-child policy for the past years, that China will begin to age before it's become affluent enough, and that will undermine it. All I can say about that is that every demographic projection and consequences thereof since Malthus have been wrong. Which doesn't mean that they will not eventually be right. It just means that there's no great reason to believe that the perception of demography being destiny will hold any more substance in the future than it has in the past. What's interesting about India, of course, is India has a more favorable demographic curve in that it has a lot of young people now who will become, wealthier and support an aging population. But India is still a much more internal economic story. China is a much more integrated economic story with the world. I imagine we could be sitting here in years and talking about India as an integrated economic story, but India's taken the path of we will develop internally before opening up to the world commercially. China's taken the path of we will open up to the world commercially in order to develop internally. And those are two different pathways, both of which seem to be viable right now, and not competitive. So I think there's a lot to be said of kind of both the demographic paths here. And I don't think either is going to imperil this development, certainly not in the next decade or so.